All right. We are trying this YouTube thing that I have put off for many years and figured it would be best to start the channel and start the series with a couple book reviews, a couple of classics, and a couple books that have helped me at least in pushing myself forward and getting my mind and my whole life in order to be able to be where I am today. All right, so starting off with the classic that probably many have read but very few have understood, and that's Peter Drucker's Managing Oneself. It was a Harvard Business Review classic. And I was actually reading a little bit about Peter Drucker before starting this, kind of his biography on Wikipedia, and surprisingly, he has quite an interesting history that I don't think a lot of people have really dug into. I mean, the guy fled Nazi Germany back in the 30s when he saw the Jewish persecution start, and eventually ended up coaching and mentoring some of the top managers, business leaders of his time well into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this little book right here has got quite a lot of press and attention over the past couple of decades, especially since Peter Drucker passed away in the early 2000s. There's my clock. So that's a ship bell clock. Goes off every half hour, lets me know how much we're running on time here. If you don't like clocks and timepieces, I highly recommend you get into them. They're quite interesting and really intricate. But anyway, not to go off on a tangent. So this book right here, it's a very short book, almost like a short essay of just some thoughts and findings. It's only 55 pages long. It's really not that dense. You can read through it in probably an afternoon just by the pool if you have a couple of minutes. If you're a speed reader, I'd assume it probably would take you maybe 10, 15 minutes. You could skim through it pretty fast, but this is one of those books where the length is not so much important as the actual density of the words and the content that you have to reread a couple times to really understand the nuances of the sentences. You know, I would recommend reading this book at least 2 to 3 times on your first pass, and then picking it up again a week later to redigest the content and think over some of the sayings, quotes, and some of the lessons in it. But I took a couple here, and I want to give you all the abridged version. You know, I prefer smaller books like these because you get a bigger sense of accomplishment, and your brain actually has a better feedback loop mechanism where if you go through a dense book, it may take you a long time to go through the chapters and get to the meat and potatoes of it. Whereas smaller books like this, you know, you can peruse and skim through and maybe finish in a day or two, and your brain automatically rewards you by, you know, giving you that dopamine rush by saying, hey, you finished this, congrats. And most of the time, shorter books also are short for a reason, because the author gets right to the point, which is very important if you're trying to be cognizant of time, right? But I took a couple notes here. I'm sure many people interpret this book in other ways, but you know, this is how I interpret it. You know, I have some main ideas and the main takeaways from Managing Oneself. So, for instance, in the beginning of the book, Peter Drucker talks a lot about write down what you expect to happen in 9 to 12 months. Most people are very off from expectations versus reality. And a good exercise that everyone should do is write down what you expect to happen when you do a major decision, or you have a major change, or you're embarking on a new journey, and write down the moment that you make that decision, what you expect to happen in 9 to 12 months. And then compare the two. When the time passes and you get to that point in history where you think you will have accomplished this, or you think you will have done this, see how different the forecast is from the actual results. And Drucker says this feeds into a feedback loop where you can then fine-tune a lot of your findings and see if you're actually a doer or if you're an advisor. And that goes into another point that Drucker makes here, which is as illuminating as the first, is that most people think they're good at something. Most people think that they can be good at something. And in reality, most people are wrong. Most people are not, in fact, good at things. There's a quote in here where he says, "Not everyone is born a mathematician, but you can learn math, and you can learn mathematics and algebraic equations, simple arithmetic, all the way up to trigonometry, and maybe even further to, physics and, quantum mechanics, for instance. You can eventually learn those things, but to actually create those things and to be born a mathematician, that requires a certain innate character that 99% of people won't have. And chances are, if you're listening to this video, you are not a mathematician, and neither am I. I don't have the ability to sit in a room and just think up theorems like Einstein that could change the course of history. But we don't need to. We can always learn it, right? But you have to have a sense of self in the beginning, whether or not that's you or if it's not. And you can learn this through feedback. Learn it from others. What feedback are others giving you? Are others telling you that you're good at something? Or are others telling you that you're not good at something? Sometimes to learn what you're not good at requires the inversion principle. First, you have to learn what you're not good at. And then you can dial in and strip away the fat and find what you're good at. Anyway, so Drucker goes on, and this book, by the way, I think was written in the 60s. Could have even been later than that. But the principles in this book apply as much today as any other time in history, especially now, being that we have a knowledge working society. I would argue even that today we're moving away from knowledge workers to more attention workers, where attention is the new currency, as it has been for several years now. And with AI and automation coming in, a lot of the knowledge worker crowd is getting displaced and having to reconfigure themselves into new industries or new professions. But anyway, neither here nor there. The next point Peter Drucker makes is that you have two types of people in the knowledge working space. You have advisors and you have leaders. And you have to understand who you are as a person and how you work with people. Are you getting things accomplished in an advisory role primarily, or are you getting things accomplished by being the decision maker? And there are two very different forces here. The decision maker, while many would aspire to be the decision maker, there's a lot of responsibility. The decision maker is responsible and holds the weight of all those decisions. They are the person that everyone's going to run to when the shit hits the fan. They are the one that has to be steadfast in the decision making, and they are the one that bears the brunt of responsibility. Most people don't want responsibility, myself included. There are certain things I look at and I go, it must be nice, but at the flip side, it's a lot. It's a lot to be having to be held responsible, whether you're the owner, the CEO, or you're running your own enterprise or you're an entrepreneur. At the end of the day, you'll be responsible for the success and failure of a lot of your decisions. Most people can't bear that weight. Most people would rather advise and sit in the sidelines and claim some responsibility for any decisions, especially the successes. Most advisors love to be recognized for the success, but very few will ever acknowledge their failures, especially if it was them that was primarily advising in that capacity. So early on, you have to really understand whether you're an advisor or a leader. And there are two very distinct personality types and archetypes. And we can go into that later in another video, talk about, the different, maybe Myers-Briggs or 16 personalities, Hexaco, whatever, to really hone in on what makes the ideal leader. But early on, you should know, are people looking for you for decisions, or are they looking for you for advice in order to make their decisions? It's very hard for someone to cross the border between the two. And it takes a very distinct leader in order to eventually become that decision-making person. Anyway, moving on, onward and upward, as they say. So another thing here that Peter Drucker goes into, even back then, when this book was written, is you have to have a good idea of your values. And how do your values relate to the organization values that you find yourself in. And this could be any organization, whether you're in a company, a community, a church, religious organization, any other organization in the human hierarchy. We all find ourselves in sociosexual hierarchy structures in every relationship that we're in, whether we're with our significant other, our spouses, our boyfriends and girlfriends, or we're with our bosses and we're with our coworkers, or we're with our parents and our family, or even society itself, where we have the hierarchy structure of workers, politicians, business leaders, all the way up to the top, where you could even say the president or whoever else runs the show behind the scenes. We're all placed in that socio-sexual hierarchy, which is something we most of the time inherit from our childhood and our past experiences, but also something we grow into as a reflection of ourselves and our own psyche. In saying that, one has to recognize, as Peter Drucker says, what are your values and what do you value the most? And how can you align that with whatever organization you're with in that part of the hierarchy? So if, for instance, you have a real disdain for selling or a disdain for capitalism, for instance, and you find yourself in a sales role or a sales-oriented company, well, that's not going to work. You're going to be miserable because your values are just completely mismatched. I found myself there multiple times. I found myself in companies and structures that were inherently deceptive, inherently, and I had to leave because I know long-term it won't work out. My values, although not perfect, I'm not infallible by any means, I still recognize a bad apple when I see one. And as the saying goes, if you put a bad apple in the cask, one rotten apple, it will eventually spread. The mold will eventually carry over to the good apples. And if you're still a good apple, you don't want to be that. You don't want to be next to that. Part of that's values. And if you can recognize it early on, you can save yourself a lot of time, money, and headaches. Moving on, Peter Drucker also says, especially when this book was written, that most knowledge workers in today's world, they have three phases. Most executives and those moving up the quote-unquote ladder, they start really in their mid-20s by recognizing their strengths and leaning into them and building on foundational strengths. You can't build a house on something that's not stable. So Peter Drucker says in the book here, you need to find out how well you work with others and how you learn and how you get stuff done. There's a core tenet of this book. In order to find your strengths, and it's far easier to build on your strengths in the beginning than it is to try to go and create new strengths or build new strengths. That almost never works. If you're born a bodybuilder and you have the frame, let's say you're a mesomorph and you have, the muscular structural components to lift heavy, you're 6'2", 200 pounds, for instance. You've played football for 10 years. It's natural for you to then go into a job or a career that pushes on those strengths, rather than, let's say, taking a step back and becoming an analytical thinker or becoming somebody that crunches spreadsheets all day. I think nowadays this is applicable, for instance, where you see some folks that are athletes most of their life, and then they get dangled this carrot of being in finance or being in a high executive role and the whole finance bro culture, and they think they have to become that, when in reality, majority of their life, they've been athletes. They've been brute force people. They haven't been analytical. And now they're trying to become something that inherently is not even in their value system, and it hasn't been cultured or maintained over many years. So the three phases here, to go back to Peter Drucker, so you have that first phase in your mid-20s where you're really climbing the ladder, you're growing, and the trajectory is up. And you're refining your strengths, and you're figuring out how you perform, and you're also cultivating your values, or you're refining ones that were previously given to you. And then knowledge workers, at least in this era when this book was written, tend to hit a peak around the mid-40s, 50s. I guess what we would call midlife crisis nowadays, but even back then, it was apparent that there was this disdain and this disassociation with those that apparently have reached the pinnacle, and then they kind of plateau, right? So you have this curve that's exponentially going up. You have higher highs and higher lows, and then most folks, they reach this point where they plateau. right? And where the point where money or even any more material possessions won't even satisfy them more. They need something new. They need a hobby. They need a passion. They need something they're genuinely interested outside of just making money and putting food on the table, for instance. And that's where Peter Drucker says you have to really find that hobby. It's at that crucial junction where your internal compass is directing you to do something else. I've had instances of that in my life, for instance, and I'm not nowhere near 45. Hopefully I look this good when I'm 45, right? But I've had that in multiple iterations, despite still being relatively young. You know, when your internal compass is telling you that this ain't right and you have to go somewhere else or you have to pivot. It's important that you pivot when you do, because your time here is numbered. Nobody knows how much time you have on this earth. That's for sure. Okay, what else here? Peter Drucker also says that you have to take responsibility for your relationships. You have to do this very early on. And you have to recognize if one relationship is being accretive or not accretive to your life, and if there's no two-way transaction going on. What do I mean by this? Well, a lot of folks find themselves in relationships nowadays where they are subservient to one or they are the provided, and there is a provider. And this is in every relationship. It doesn't have to be just a relationship based like with your spouse or with your significant other. This could go on in work. This could go on in family matters. This can go on in general friendship group. If you ever have this, and let me know in the comments below, if you ever had a friend, for instance, that you're always the one hitting them up, or you're always the one having to reach out to them, or you're always the one inviting them to parties, inviting them to dinners, inviting them to hang out. You're always the one texting or calling and, you know, inquiring about their life, seeing what's up, how are you, yada, yada. And there's never reciprocity, and they never reciprocate any of that action. You, my friend, are in a one-way relationship, and you need to reconsider that relationship. Because if that friend, whoever it may be, or that significant other, isn't responsive enough to reciprocate your altruism, or I would say your relationship altruism in that case, that's not a friend you want, because they're just not interested in you enough, or they don't find you interesting enough to be able to reciprocate that. So that's one takeaway, I would say, that you can adapt this concept into the modern era, where you have to dissect your relationships, your time with people. Are they reciprocating? Are you getting anything out of it? I mean, if you've been with someone for 5 years and you've been, let's say, in a romantic relationship, and 5 years later, you turn around and you're like, shit, am I going to marry this person? Or have we just been spinning our wheels here? That's a great question that you need to ask yourself and get into that. And with every relationship, you know, and it doesn't all need to be transactional, by the way. You know, not every relationship on this planet needs to be a function of money. There are some relationships where you just get enjoyment out of something, or you get some spiritual well-being, or there's something else involved that has nothing to do with money, for instance. But the majority of relationships are centered around money, and especially business relationships. You know, if you're constantly the one business partner that's performing and the other guy ain't, your other business partner isn't, and he's kind of, you know, off in la la land or making bad decisions, well, you need to have that hard conversation sooner rather than later, as Peter Drucker says. All right, let's talk about some of my favorite quotes in this one. So Peter Drucker, really early on in the book, he says, let me see where I find this page. I think it's page 20 here. Maybe page 30. All right. My favorite quote by Peter Drucker here in Managing Oneself. He was talking about his previous role as an investment banker in London in the 30s. You can imagine that for the finance bros. Imagine what it was like in the 30s doing spreadsheets by hand. Now you have AI to do it. That's what I did. I did modeling for a while, and then I realized AI is going to automate it, so time to learn a new skill. So Peter Drucker says here, if I may, allow me to interject a personal note. Many years ago, I too had to decide between my values and what I was doing successfully. I was doing very well as a young investment banker in London in the mid-1930s, and the work clearly fit my strengths. Yet I did not see myself making a contribution as an asset manager. People, I realized, were what I valued, and I saw no point in being the richest man in the cemetery. Now that right there hit home for me many years ago, and it still hits home every time I read that line. You don't want to be the richest man in the cemetery. You do all these things, you spend all these hours, sometimes with people you don't like, doing things that you don't want to do. And for what? To be the richest man in the cemetery? Now, obviously, most people provide for their families, which is why they have to work. I'm not knocking that, and I'm not discounting that at all. But if the difference between 120 grand a year versus 100K a year is 40 hours and lost time with your family with no real material impact to your quality of life, then I think you have to ask yourself the question, is it worth the trade-off? Is it worth being the richest man in the cemetery if you can't enjoy your wealth or enjoy any of the fruits of your labor? And that's what Peter Drucker was saying here. And he realized this nearly 100 years ago. 100 years ago, he realized this. And it hasn't really changed, I think, over the decades and over the centuries. I mean, you go back even before then, in the pre-industrial era, in the mercantile era, I think even back then, as the system was starting to develop, folks were asking themselves, what does it pay to be the richest man in the cemetery? Especially if you lose all your health, all your relationships, and all your social skills. I mean, that'd be a terrible life. I wouldn't want to do it. Peter Drucker, very intellectual individual for his time. And like I said before, his words carry more weight each time you read them. Okay, so next quote I have here by Peter Drucker is, most people think they know what they are good at. Most people are wrong. And this hit home for me, especially through my life, and trying to say to myself, I could do this. I could be good at this. You can do a lot of things in this world, I think. There's many things you can do, but you can't do everything. You got to pick one or two things. You don't want to be a jack of all trades, a master of none, as they say. I think, yeah, jack of all trades, master of none, that's how the quote goes. I also think you should take that with a grain of salt, because I think life is long and virtuous enough for you to be able to at least get good at one or two things. I think you have enough time on this planet to master two things really well. But you got to pick the right thing. You got to make sure that that's your thing, that you know what to get good at. In today's world, you don't want to get good at hoofing horses, for instance, attaching horseshoes to horses. Now, that might have been a really good job back in the 1850s or the 1860s. But right about 1910, 1920, when automobiles started getting mass produced and the cost production and unit economics of automobiles became available for the mass market, that's when we saw the shift from automobiles away from horses. At that point, you don't want to be in the horse business at all. You want to start an apprenticeship as someone who puts the hooves on horses for transit when that's happening, So to carry that forward to, let's say, today's example, you don't want to get good at anything that's going to get automated now. You don't want to get good at anything that AI is going to have a foothold in, because you will be far behind the curve by the time you acquire any of the necessary skills and mastery to be proficient in that area. Why would you want to get good at coding nowadays, for instance? I've thought about this myself. Maybe I could learn a little Python, learn a little C++. I've coded some algorithms for financial derivatives before. Let me get into it. But then I ask myself and I say, well, what's the point? I'm going to spend the next 18 months to 24 months failing, most likely, in doing that. And then by that time, something new is going to come out, or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever is going to have a new iteration, and it's all going to be automated. It's pointless. The world moves so fast nowadays that you have to have such a keen self of managing yourself to be able to know these things in the foresight. You don't want to get good at the wrong thing. And that's what Peter Drucker was saying here. Peter Drucker then says, in regards to visionaries and leaders, and let's see if I can pull up this quote, because this quote really stuck home as well. Maybe it's 54. Let's see. No, that's not it. Oh, here it is. So Peter Drucker then goes on to say, people don't move mountains, bulldozers move mountains. But you need to be able to have the idea and to get the bulldozers to work. So what Drucker's saying there is a lot of folks iterate on ideas, kind of the analysis by paralysis saying, when in reality, the workers who are going to accomplish your vision, or the work that's needed to be done to accomplish your vision, is oftentimes very different from the vision itself. Sometimes you need a bulldozer to move the mountain, because the mountain is not going to move itself. If you want to move a big pile of dirt 100 feet in the air, if you go out there with a shovel and maybe a couple of your friends, it's going to take you a long time to move that whole pile of dirt to wherever it's got to go. But if you innovate, or you use your brain to architect the vision more clearly, and you get a bulldozer, well, all of a sudden you're picking up big scoops of dirt, and you could be done in a day or two, maybe even shorter, depending on where the dirt's going and how big of a flatbed truck you got. And then lastly, Peter Drucker says, you have to realize whether you're a reader or a listener. So most people in this world, most people are listeners. They listen. And through the school system, for instance, they've been taught over several years how to listen. And their brain has, in some cases, subconsciously programmed them on how to think based upon how they listen. So if you're listening versus reading, as Peter Drucker says, the readers are the ones who sit back and concoct information over several hours. They pregame, if you will. Whereas the listeners can go in and be more responsive, more attentive. In the book, Peter Drucker talks about the difference in General Eisenhower between the time where he was supreme leader of the Allied forces in Europe versus when he was president. When he was a military leader, he was a reader. His generals, his lieutenants would prepare reports for him before any press briefings, and he had to do anything. He would read these reports, process the information, and then he'd be able to distill it concurrently for all the journalists at all the news conferences as he updated everybody on the progress that the Allies were making in the Second World War. But when he switched and became president a few years later, all of a sudden he was thrown into a press room and had to respond quickly to questions that were sometimes off script, or he didn't have any response already ready to give for those questions. And that's where he got kind of put in the hot seat, and his leadership style was brought into question. And the same general that was responding to the flurry of questions and knocking them down left and right during the Second World War, all of a sudden looked pretty incompetent. Not because he was an incompetent person, but because he didn't realize, as Peter Drucker says in the book, that he was a reader, and he had to have that time to process information, to distill it in order to give it out in the most coherent way possible. And when he shifted into more of a answering service for reporters, all of a sudden his leadership style kind of collapsed. And Peter Drucker says here that you have to really understand if you're a reader or listener early on. So can you respond quickly? Can you pull information that wasn't there already? Or do you need to sit down and analyze and then formulate your own opinion or response thereof? So all in all, you could read this book 10, 20, 30, 50 times, and you'll still find something new each time. And that's why I like it. It's a really good, dense book that you get a lot of bang for your buck. It's short, it's quick, it's sweet. And it applies today as much as it did 50 to 70 years ago. So Managing Oneself, cult classic. Make sure you give it a read. Please give me a follow here, like and subscribe, and we'll be doing a couple more of these.